Hello, and welcome to the first of my book reviews that I'm planning on doing. Eventually, I'm planning on doing a much larger series of these. Some of them will be a tie-in with my podcast, and others will just be books that I have found amazing, books that I highly recommend, books that various publishers send me to review, and also books that I just think need to have more airtime. So on today's first episode, I'm going to be tying this in with an interview that I'm going to be doing this week. I'm going to be having on Essence podcast the folklorist and folk healer from the Ozark region, Brandon Weston. Brandon is also published by the same author, by the same publisher as me, and I'm really looking forward to having them on the show. So I received their books a couple of months ago, I should say. So I received Ozark Folk Magic, Plants, Prayers, and Healing. I also received the secondary book, Ozark Mountain Spell Book, Folk Magic and Healing. And I also was very fortunate to be asked by Brandon to look at their new book that's coming out, which is Granny Thornapple's Book of Magic, and that book is out for a pre-order right now. We're going to be speaking more about that tomorrow with the podcast Essence podcast episode, so do check that out. But for right now, let's talk about these two. So when I first received these, I also looked for the audio version. I often find that I learn a lot better when I'm able to listen to the audio and then look through and reread sections. And so I found the audio version of this. This does not have an audio version as far as I know, but that's okay because everything that was relevant was in here. So let's talk about the first book, Ozark Folk Magic. I had not known much about the Ozark region beforehand. A friend of mine sets many of his stories in the Ozark region, and looks at mythology through that region's folklore, but I didn't really know much about it. So this was quite a lovely introduction to that region. The Ozarks are the region just kind of west of the Appalachians, just north of Oklahoma. So we're looking at Missouri and that whole region there. It's a mountainous region, very similar to the Appalachians. And what I really loved about this book in particular is that Brandon is not only a native of this region, but has also studied it at an academic level, and currently studies it as a folklorist. And I found this had very nice balance between information, pure information, but also context. So Brandon, as a native individual of that region, was able to not only take the kind of the raw data, and speak to that, but also apply it to their own personal life. And I really connected with Brandon through this book. As a non-binary individual themselves, they talk about how to bridge the traditions that they grew up with and were uncovering to fit in and to relate to their personal identity of various different forms of identity. So the book is not just kind of pure information, but there is a vast amount of information in this. It's only a short book. It's only 240 pages long, so about the same size as my book. And what I realized actually by being sent this as well is that really these two books form one volume. They really do complement each other very well, whereas this is a lot more of the context and the history and taking you through the region and all of the traditions. This is then just purely the traditions, and Brandon has outlined this very nicely. So just going through the table of contents here somewhere. So really there are 5 major pieces. So there's 8 major parts. There's part 2, which is fortune and good luck, all sorts of rituals and spells connected to that. And then rituals and spells connected to love and relationships, magical cleansings, protection, retribution, dreaming, and divination. And all of these, a lot of these in here are referenced in this book here. And this book, I quite liked the flow of it. I really appreciated the flow of it, actually. So how Brandon starts, it's in 2 parts, majorly parts, and the first part is really taking you through the area, taking you through the traditions piece by piece. Brandon talks about the approach to traditional healing. They talk about the context of the settlement of the area, so really gives you that historical background. And I really appreciated learning more about how the intersection between the Scots-Irish, the coming from Appalachia, the indigenous Native American traditions that were already there, the southern hoodoo and southern conjure traditions that were coming up from the south, and really placing the Ozarks as a meeting point, as a border region between different various cultural zones, while also emphasizing that it is its own cultural region. It isn't just a crossroads. It is a lot more than that. And for those who live and dwell in this place, it is a lot more than just a staging point to go somewhere else. I really also appreciated what Brandon had to say about it being a living culture. The way that Appalachia and the Ozarks too are often framed in media is as the site of the Beverly Hillbillies, or as hillfolk that are dangerous and somehow out of the way and not connected. I really appreciated that Brandon centered you in the landscape, talked about that history, talked about the culture of independence, and that strong independence from region to region, even within the Ozarks themselves. I also really appreciated what they had to say about the intersection of Christianity and folk tradition, and that Christian folk tradition that's such a huge part of this region, but also the element of folk tradition that is expansive. And Brandon makes the point that oftentimes the Ozarks and Appalachia and other forms of folk tradition are often co-created by the people who live there. And because now the people who live there, and well, not just now, but throughout time, so many different peoples have come through that region and settled and added to that tapestry, that the folk tradition has adapted to that landscape in particular. I also really appreciated that Brandon, throughout both books, talk about how the traditions have evolved and changed as more diversity either moves into the area or becomes apparent. So Brandon, as a non-binary person, talks about that, how to adapt and how to find oneself as a non-binary person within these traditions for themselves. They talk about some of the other practitioners that they meet, including things like feng shui or acupuncture, I think is one of the traditions spoken about in here, and how the tradition bends and shifts and creates openings for new additions. Brandon also talks about appropriation and cultural appropriation in this, and so they temper that piece with the understanding that cultural appropriation, how that can come into the conversation and how it does come into the conversation. There was really a lot that I appreciated in these books. I really appreciated how Brandon also linked not only the history but also the lived tradition now. I think that so often folk traditionalists find themselves in that awkward place of having to explain that these traditions are not just from the past, that they are living now. So many of the things that people grew up with sometimes were existing in the family. They talk about how some of these traditions have died off, how some of these traditions have been recreated, and I think that really is a good reminder for either the neo-pagan or the witchcraft community to understand that it isn't all just Reconstructionism, that there are traditions that are existing and have been passed down. Brandon goes through and talks about how in this tradition, the tradition passed itself down, the various different types of figures that existed within the culture that would have been understood to be the conveyor of that information, how that information was traditionally passed down, and then how now the information is being passed down. The example that they give is if one of the old wart doctors who are who are magical practitioners, particularly adept at removing warts. If one of them dies and they haven't passed down the information in a traditional way, then that's a loss of the whole community. But also how new practitioners are taking up the mantle of these traditions, how they're identifying themselves. The example that Brandon gives in this is that traditionally in this culture, as many other folk traditions around the world, they wouldn't have used the word witch, because witch was more of a demonic, monstrous, non-human figure, something to be taken care of, as opposed to identify as. Now, because of Wicca, because of neo-paganism, that identity of witch has become really has been taken up by younger generations. And so how is that then coming into the culture, and how is that being kind of impacted? I think what my takeaway from this, although all of it is connected to the Ozarks and that particular region, it's written in such a way that Brandon invites you to take up these traditions for yourself, to explore these traditions for yourself, but stresses understand them within the cultural context that they come from, which I think, going through all of the rest of these books behind me here, will be a recurring theme. Understand these traditions in the culture that they come from, adapt them for your own culture perhaps, but understand where those roots are coming from. And I think that's a really important point. I'm going to be talking more to Brandon tomorrow about these. I'm really looking forward to that. Very newest book that's coming out, the Granny Thornapple book, is just delightful. It is so beautiful, and I look forward to being able to do a review of that. That is out for pre-order. These came out last year, and are available through Llewellyn or anywhere you find books. If you check here, I'm going to try tomorrow to put the podcast interview right here. So click on this link, and tomorrow, not tonight, tomorrow, and do join us for that conversation. In the meantime, thank you for listening, and have a good rest of the night.